I am so excited to be able to bring you, Tracy, to Kirkridge, and so many of my Kirkridge friends to get to meet you, but so many of my South Carolina friends to also get to meet my other Kirkridge friends. This is the book that I am so excited about, Forever Free. And if you're having trouble finding me or Tracy on this screen, if you go up to where it says view in the right-hand corner and just hit speaker, then you'll be able to easily find us. And then if you want to go back to gallery so you can see everyone, that's just fine. One of the things I've learned a lot about in these last 18, 20 months of COVID is how to be present on Zoom. So I really want to welcome you. And one of the things I've learned, Tracy, is that we're all in person. We're online, but we're in person. And I love that. And I love that we can see each other and that we can respond to each other. I was trying to remember how many years ago it was, Tracy, that I met you. I just know because I do things by children's ages that it's way more than 20 because it was before children, and your oldest one just turned 20. Right. So, and you were a relatively young teacher. And I just remember at that time, from the very beginning, you and I connected around reading, but we also connected around education's role in healing the wounds of racism and the power of literacy in children's lives. And now you've written about that so eloquently that I'm just really excited to be able to share that. I was going to start by giving some of my memories of you and some of how I know you, but then I read your book, and your mother does that so incredibly in the story that you tell when your mother talks about how you came into the world, that I thought I would just ask you if you would start by reading your mother's story of how you came into the world.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sally. This is from the introduction. My mother likes to tell the story of the day I was born. She tells me and whoever else will listen that I was just 4 pounds, so small that I could fit in the palm of my daddy's hand. From the start, though, my sound and my size did not match up. When I came along, the 7th of 7 children, my mother had been working in the hospital cafeteria for years. Many of the nurses on the maternity ward were friends, so they gave her a heads up about her new bundle of joy. If you go down to the nursery and look for her, don't get scared. There's nothing wrong. We just had to move her to the back corner of the room. You see, as soon as we get all the other babies settled and sleeping, she starts hollering and wakes them up. She's about the tiniest and the noisiest thing we have had in here in a long time. This is when my mother gets a twinkle in her eye and delivers her a punchline with a smile. She's not 4 pounds anymore, but she is surely still noisy. Whenever she tells that story to a group of strangers after I've given a public talk or she's read something I've written, I just put an arm around her shoulder and explain that I always had a lot to say. Though I can't fathom what I could have been trying to communicate to the babies in the hospital nursery, I can definitely identify with the feeling of wanting to be heard, struggling to raise my voice in a world where people like me are expected to be quiet. All my life, I've been trying to figure out why the world wouldn't want to hear me or receive me with open arms, the way my daddy always did on Sunday mornings, when I was dressed for church and my hair was pressed into shiny curls. I grew up knowing that there was something of value pulsing through my veins. My parents constantly urged me to raise my voice, whether it was through making speeches at my church or singing in the choir with the other kids whose parents pushed them to learn what it meant to stand in the spotlight, to be heard. I have wanted to tell stories, to tell my story, from the time I was in elementary school, scribbling them down on half sheets of paper and sharing them with my friends on the school bus. Yet, I was constantly aware of the forces that wanted to silence me. They were heavy in the air, pushing down on me from some invisible loft, pushing in on me from every side. They were the voices of my teachers at school, who carved out a time for talking and a time for listening, who valued compliance over intellect. They were the voices of the women in the community who looked at you from the corner of their eye when you chewed gum in church or laughed a little too loudly with the boys. It was the voice of my mother reminding me that I went to school to learn, not to teach the teacher. Don't you make that school have to call me on my job. I have walked that tightrope all my life, struggling to figure out how to manage the stories that take shape behind my eyes in the black of the night, just before sleep creeps in, how to learn the rules of engagement, keeping the story safe until the time was right to let them be known. The punishment for stepping out of line would be swift and harsh. Those who love me wanted me to understand that a voice could be the most dangerous thing for a little Black girl in the 70s to have, in a world where little Black girls were problems. Make no mistake, we didn't just cause problems, we were problems.
Wow. Tracy, the power of your voice, the power of your words comes through. So I read them to myself, but now hearing them in your voice makes them even more powerful. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Sally.
One of the things you and I have talked about and laughed about is that we're both readers, and we're a lot of other things too, but really that's what we are first. I mean, I think it's because I'm a reader that I'm a teacher. It's because I'm a reader that I'm a learner. It's because I'm a reader that I'm a seeker. And I sort of get some of that as I read your book, and particularly as you talk about how important books have always been to you. Again, I just so love the way that you've written about this. May I ask you to read from your book some of how you tell us how important books are to you?
Of course. This is from chapter 1. Books have always been some of my most powerful and influential teachers. From the times my father found the energy to read to me after having worked long hours at the stainless steel plant, to the Wednesday nights my mother took me with her to Bible study in a little abandoned building that used to be a store where I bought Jolly Ranchers and atomic fireballs. Words were wrapped around my shoulders like a patchwork quilt. They were a river of ideas and sounds on which I floated and into which I trailed my fingers. Losing myself within them gave me the freedom to stare into a distant, cloudless sky and dream. Like everything else I needed when I was a young child, my parents provided me with books, but I have no recollection of where they came from. I remember being surrounded by them at an early age. Maybe they had a subscription to a children's book club, or perhaps they picked them up from the store when they went shopping. Whatever the case, books were a big part of my childhood, and on many nights I would brush my teeth, change into my nightgown, and slide under the covers to wait for Daddy to read with me before we kneeled next to the bed to pray. My favorite book was The Monster at the End of This Book, the story of Grover, the furry blue Sesame Street character who kept warning us to stop turning pages because of the monster he knew was waiting at the end. He tied ropes to the pages so we wouldn't turn them. He built brick walls so we couldn't reach the end. When we finally arrived at the end of the book, we, the readers and Grover himself, discovered that the monster was just him. That book made me laugh so hard, I almost fell out of the bed every time I heard it. After we said prayers and Daddy kissed my forehead and walked out of my bedroom, I'd open the book next to my Donald Duck nightlight and look at the pictures until my eyes burned with sleep. In addition to Grover, I fell in love with the Berenstain Bears and Dr. Seuss and a host of other colorful books with words that rhymed. I'd go on to discover the Boxcar Children and Ramona the Pest when I was in elementary school. By the time I reached middle school, I had found Judy Blume and devoured every book she'd ever written. My sister Evelyn was a voracious reader and would let me borrow books from her well-stocked shelves, which contained a few Harlequin romances and the entire Flowers in the Attic series by V.C. Andrews. In high school, I dragged myself toward the summer reading list I needed to complete to be ready for my advanced English classes in the fall. At that stage in my development, I preferred books that mirrored my reality, and I didn't think my teachers would include anything that would interest me. To my surprise, I couldn't get enough of Wuthering Heights and Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Watership Down captured my imagination in a way I didn't expect. They weren't mirrors, but windows into another world, the temporary escape from real life that I needed. Then, one summer, I took a long look at the choices on the list and chose Richard Wright's Native Son, which introduced me to what some young Black boys in the city faced. It raised questions of racial inequality and economic despair. I can still remember Bigger Thomas's fear rising from the pages of that paperback like smoke. With that book in my hand, I was completely at Wright's mercy, and my love for reading was solidified. These mentors, these books of mine, spoke in no uncertain terms about the value system that should guide a life worth living. From an early age, my moral compass was set toward considering the most vulnerable members of this community. Through a confluence of situations and explicit instruction, I internalized the lesson that would shape my entire life. How we treat those with the least power and influence will ultimately define us. My mentors on the page and in real life fervently taught that at the end of the day, it is not about protecting the rich and the elite or positioning them to gather more wealth. It is the opposite end of the income spectrum that needs our attention most. Turning our backs on the poor is not only callous, but foolish, since we are all inextricably tied to one another as citizens of one nation, one planet. No man is an island, and the quality of life experienced by the poor is not so much a referendum on their lack of ambition as an indictment of the privileged and the comfortable.
Thank you. Again, one of the things as I listen to the power of your voice, reading the power of your words, is you affirm for me something that I've always known, that reading is a political act. And I think that one of the things that you talk about in Forever Free is the intersectionality of race and racism and racial healing and education and reading and literacy. And again, you do this so powerfully in the book as you talk about race and racism, that I want to ask you again if you will read to us a passage from the book in which you begin to tell a little bit more than you've already even touched on.
Sure, I'm reading from page 13 now. It says, as a child, I never gave much thought to the stereotypes that define the way white America thought of us. But I realize now how much of my rearing was designed to prove them wrong. Many in our community subscribe to what the Harvard professor Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham called respectability politics, the belief that conforming to mainstream standards of appearance or behavior will protect a marginalized group from systemic injustice. We were taught to carry ourselves in a way that reflected brilliance by bringing home good grades. We had to prove that we had home training by saying yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. We wore creases in our designer jeans so sharp they'd cut your finger, expelled the kinks from our hair, and spoke with just the right amount of European lilt. Maybe they could recognize our worth, see that we weren't so different after all. We were taught that conforming was the best way to survive and get ahead in a nation that punished individuality and demanded assimilation. If only bigotry could be solved with a school uniform, if only books could make babies bulletproof. It wasn't until I began my graduate studies that I repeatedly encountered the terms poor people, low-income communities, and underprivileged at-risk youth in the readings my professors assigned. As I read books and articles by Richard L. Allington, like What Really Matters for Struggling Readers, and Jonathan Kozol's Savage Inequalities, I began to better understand my place in America's story and how poor people were situated in the context of public education. It seems strange to me that those labels were even necessary. In my experience, people are just trying to navigate an environment that can sometimes be hostile and sometimes flooded with joy. I knew that there were alcoholics and drug dealers in the Black community just as there were in the white community. There were poor people of every race making decisions that were not exactly laudable, but were absolutely necessary for survival. What educators described in terms of the other, I simply thought of as real life. It made me uncomfortable to label people who look like me, but I also understood the language of the privileged, whose support I needed to help address the inequities in my own communities. I had to talk like them to gain their trust, to sacrifice my comfort for theirs. This became apparent in graduate school, but only became more necessary as I began to develop a grassroots nonprofit. Of all the trade-offs I had to make to survive, this may have been the most difficult. Centering white people's communication style and perspective is a constant betrayal of my own. It pierces the soul, causing the kind of pain that simmers and in time either collapses into itself as exhaustion or bubbles over as rage. A lot of what led to my future success could be attributed to the luck of the draw. I was blessed to grow up in a two-parent household with healthy, aspirational parents who were not drug addicts and who didn't struggle with debilitating illnesses or chronic unemployment. I didn't witness repeated acts of domestic violence, wasn't forced to starve. My parents surrounded me with encyclopedias and volumes of hardback reference books from Johnson Publishing, which also produced Ebony and Jet magazines each month. These books helped me embrace my Blackness and celebrate the richness of my history. Not everyone I knew enjoyed these privileges, and I realized that my circumstances were a product of God's grace. I didn't get to choose when and where I was born, or to whom and in what skin. As the direct result of these blessings, being at the right place at the right time, and a natural gift for communication, I found myself in a position to embrace philanthropy, molded by lessons that I had been taught from the day I took my first breath. I said yes to the call to put vulnerable people first in a radical way. Not knowing the full extent of what I was getting myself into, I made a decision that would impact every aspect of my life. This book is about what it has meant for me to walk alongside the most unprotected among us, to run into brick walls and taste the agony of defeat, to stand in solidarity with and show compassion for Black people, immigrants, anyone lacking access to the resources they need to get where they want to go. This book is about carrying the knowledge that so much more good work is possible, but also knowing that the money, power, and influence to do more for the scores of children who could use our support to do more, who could use our support are just beyond my reach. This is a story of a nation that has made promises to African Americans and other people of color that have not been kept.
The timeliness of your words after the elections yesterday, and with all of the angry words going on in our country about so-called critical race theory, really strikes me, Tracy, that your words are almost prophetic. I mean, they are your lived experience, and yet what you're also offering to many of us, because of your courage and your clarity, is a way to take a step back and perhaps really see what's going on. As I look around this screen, these rectangles with the other faces here, I know that a lot of the others here are also people who have really chosen to spend their lives in ways that they can support and work with and be in advocacy for the most vulnerable. So I'm guessing that, that there's a lot of resonance for people with your words.
Mm.
And I know that many of them have questions and want to talk to you, but I so love what you've written. I'm going to just ask you to read one more piece. One of the things I love so much about your book is that somehow you've combined memoir with really telling us how to change the world, that there's some real practical kinds of stuff there, as well as just wonderful, wonderful your story and your work. And I just want to ask you to read one more piece that really sort of talks about both of those, that is your story, but also is sort of your how-to.
Okay, so Sally, I think the section we're referring to is near the end of the book. Is that correct? Around page 167? So
sorry, I muted myself. I was thinking about the one on page 30.
Okay, gotcha.
If that will work, and maybe save that other one for towards the end.
Gotcha. So I'll pick up at the bottom of page 30. It says, this book explores what it means to be the student who is sent away from the classroom into a restrictive learning environment, the student who has witnessed the shooting in her neighborhood, or the student who is yet to explore the magic of reading. What strategies exist to make the playing field level for them and their families? How can we make critical thinking, self-discipline, curiosity, leadership, motivation, responsibility for learning, and school literacy skills a part of our national conversation about equity and justice? A large part of the solution lies with the willingness of our nation to recognize and assume responsibility for the dark corners of our education system, and then take steps to shine a light on them. We must be careful, deliberate, and thoughtful in our efforts so as not to repeat the mistakes that have been made in the past. We must take great pains not to allow our motivations and intentions to be tainted by guilt, shame, blame, or pity. These efforts, though seemingly noble, ultimately end up perpetuating the very cycles of inequality they seek to ameliorate. But there is a better way. Numerous programs are being implemented around the country to see how to improve children's low reading skills. I developed one such program, Freedom Readers, and offer it in the pages that follow as a way forward. This approach to strengthening communities and the educational prospects of all children invites those who have had the benefit of a good education into low-income areas for the purpose of growing literacy skills together. The program's model makes it possible for partnerships between scholars and tutors to flourish, making the time spent together meaningful for everyone involved. As a part of a community development strategy, this approach has the potential to target children's needs, giving them a chance to gain the academic and soft skills necessary for success. I've seen it work here in rural Southern communities, and I'm convinced that it can work around the country. Not only do the children and their families find it beneficial, but tutors benefit from a more complete understanding of the struggles these families face. Side by side, the tutor and scholar create a new context for learning, one that challenges the need for a double consciousness and centers the unique and extraordinary story of every single child.
Wow. I feel like one of the things that you have done is created a genre that nobody's really done quite this way before, that you have, with your story, through your story, also told us how you came to create Freedom Readers and given us hope. And I love that that's really your subtitle, a true story of hope in the fight for child literacy. I want to invite Justine into this conversation because as much as I love to hear you read, I know Justine loves to hear you and others tell stories. So let me invite you to come in, Justine, with whatever questions you might have for Tracy.
Thank you so much, Sally. And Tracy, thank you so much for taking the time to read specific sections. Welcome for those who joined a bit late and missed the introduction. You're here and that's so wonderful. We're going to spend the rest of the time in question and answer sessions. So the invitation is I will start with 2 questions to Tracy, and then I invite you to use the chat to ask questions. I can read them, or you can unmute yourself and read them out loud. And I'll try and monitor space and time because I think we could go all night. And if you haven't picked up the book, I think this was a perfect teaser. You're already in love. I can see it on your faces. It's a beautiful book that weaves what Sally just described, some overarching macro level themes. I was shocked at the statistic about how many people who identify as Black are PhD candidates, right? About 5%. And yes.
Yeah.
And then also that lived experience that Tracy, you shared to match that. So micro and macro levels. And when I was connected to Tracy through Sally, we had a beautiful conversation. And part of that was about intergenerational learning. And this conversation is that Tracy, you open with sharing about your mom, you talk about legacy. I'm curious about that. What gems of wisdom would you like to share with this group that you've learned from those who have come before you?
Justine, thank you for that question. That is a really good question. We had a dinner at my house about a week ago. Now that everybody is vaccinated, we'd love to have the opportunity to come together. And my sister was in the process of relocating. And I remembered something that my father said to me when I was really young. I couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. And I think that I had told him something that he found later was not the truth. So he sat down and he looked at me and he just looked me in the eyes and he said, "Baby, the only thing you have in this world is your word. And so you really have to be careful about giving your word to people and what you say to people, because that's your reputation." And so I've always kind of kept that close to my heart, especially when I started doing work in low-income communities. And I remember sitting with one of the principals that worked with those children, and she said to me, I mean, I could just tell that she didn't really have a lot of, faith that what I was talking about would actually come to pass. She said, "People come in and out of these communities all the time. I've seen lots of people come and make promises and they're gone in a month or 2 months because the work is hard." But that didn't happen in my case, because 11 years later, we're still going into those communities because my father planted a seed in my spirit when I was young. When you give somebody your word, you have to keep it, because pretty much that's all you have in this life is your word.
Thank you. That's good wisdom for all of us. I had shared an article with Sally earlier this week about the differences of newer generations entering the workforce. And I think some sort of legacy about what that means and what that looks like, what you live into about keeping your word lives on. So thank you for sharing that. In your book, you also write about that this work is to be done as a collective. We cannot do this alone. And you shared no man is an island unto himself, of course, family. What advice actually would you give to those who are in this space, thinking about your own legacy? What advice would you give for us to feel inspired to commit to this work, to join you, to start this in our own communities, however we can? What's the advice you would continue to pass on?
That's another wonderful question, Justine. So I think that the one thing that I had to learn very early on, and I heard this affirmed by a really great nonprofit leader, Charles Weathers. He works with a lot of people who lead nonprofits. And when he said this, it really resonated with me because I think I had to learn this before I could even articulate it. The work might come through you, but it's not about you. So I'll say it one more time. The work might come through you, but the work is not about you. And so many, many times I had to swallow my pride, put my ego aside, remember once again what the mission was, and that the work is all about the children and what they're getting out of it. Whether I'm recognized for the work, whether I get applause. I mean, I'll never in my life again have the opportunity to be teacher of the year because I'm not going to be teaching in a classroom, I don't believe. So I just had to remember that the affirmation and the validation that I'm looking for would come in ways that were surprising to me and maybe some others. And so this is what I will say to you. If you want to do this work or any work like it, remember that our egos have to take a back seat to the actual mission and the power that the work can achieve.
Ooh, that is a good gem of wisdom. Holy moly. I love that. Thank you. And I think that's also counterculture when we think about white supremacy or dominant culture. It is very much the individual. And so even that reframe is really helpful when we talk about anti-racism work and education and literacy work. And I think that goes nicely into the first question. Thank you, Beth. In the chat is, can you talk a little more about what it means to be an abolitionist teacher?
Beth, I want to thank you for that question. And I also want to thank you for your work. I very much look forward to finding out more about it. I know a little bit, but I want to know more. I use that term abolitionist teacher because in my thinking about the way that we've set up our education system right now and what it has done to many children of color, I feel as if the same spirit that Frederick Douglass had when he fought so hard to abolish the institution of enslavement, that spirit has to be a part of what drives us to not just reform education, but to try to imagine a different way, to try to chart a new course, to try to clear a new path. If we are working with an education system that we can agree is built on a foundation of white supremacy, then we really have to think about ways to set aside what we've been doing for all of these years and come up with a new plan that is going to be, at least have the potential to be fresh and inspiring and hopeful. So for me to be an abolitionist teacher, it means, number one, being honest about what I see in front of me and what's been happening. And number two, being as creative and innovative as I can be about moving in the opposite direction. I hope that shed some light on that term that I used in the book, Beth.
Can I respond to that a little bit? Is it okay?
Great.
Thank you, Tracy, for that answer. I think that I asked that question because, as you probably know, I work for a private school and have for pretty much my entire career. And I've often gotten a lot of flack about the fact that private schools can't serve the needs of everyone, and that we have to put all our dollars and all our effort into public schools. And while I believe that education has to be accessible to each and every person, I'm not sure that the current structure of public schools is serving everyone equally anyway. In fact, I think, and for many people, it's damaging. And so the first, but reading that in your book about abolitionist teacher was the first time that I ever came across someone else who seemed to be maybe saying the same thing. So I just wanted to look into that and see.
Well, Beth, I do want to say that that term is being used a lot more widely right now amongst educators. And I would recommend that you check out a book by Bettina Love called We Want to Do More Than Survive.
Okay.
And I think that you will find a lot of inspiration there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. My friend Jeff Bransberg is here. Hi, Jeff Bransberg.
I will share that resource in tomorrow's email, and any other resources Tracy shares. It's beautiful. I would support that in recommending everyone to purchase that. Tracy, that's great. You know Jeffrey. So the question is about, early in the book, you refer to books as mentors. Can you expand a bit on that? Way of thinking about books that's never occurred to me.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the books that I've read growing up, and even books that I read now, kind of give me an insight into how people think about the world and how they negotiate problems. So I try to glean a lot from the books that I read, and not just the stories themselves, but just the spirit of creativity. For instance, I've read every one of the books in Maya Angelou's autobiographical series. And from each one of those books, I get a different perspective on how she engaged with the world. And it informs who I am as a person. So that's the way that I look at a lot of the books that I read, not just nonfiction, but fiction as well. So I can learn from these characters without having to necessarily go through what they've gone through. But when I can see something that both of us have gone through, then it really helps me to reflect on the decisions that I have made and decisions that I will make in the future. And that's one of the number one reasons that I'm so passionate about putting books into the hands of young people, because I want them to have that same library of mentorship that I feel that I have when I pick up these books. Does that answer your question, Jeff? Did I do a good job? Thank you. Thank you.
I love that you're asking if you're answering the questions, and what a beautiful like engagement of this is a conversation.
Yeah.
And I just invite any other questions. Sally, I see you've unmuted yourself. Do you want to add something?
Well, I'm just aware that there are some people here that have actually been worked in the Freedom Readers as tutors of children. And I just wonder if anybody would like to share your own learning from being a mentor, from working in Freedom Readers.
I would like to share. I'm Jackie Hendricks. My husband's name keeps coming up on my iPad, but I have the privilege of being a tutor. And unfortunately, because of COVID, that has it has come to a stop for me, but I'm looking forward to getting back. And it's probably one of the best experiences I've ever had. Watching Tracy in a classroom of children in itself is a treat. She is so wonderful with these kids, and they are immediately pay attention to everything she says and does everything she says, and with a lot of joy, I might add. But it's just a wonderful program, and I hope that it can just expand because the need is so there. And if we can reach as many children as we can and teach them to love reading and learning, and also accepting themselves as the wonderful kids that they are. I think those accomplishments will mean a lot for years to come, and we will all benefit from those. So thank you, Tracy.
Jackie, I want to thank you for your kind words and for your investment in this program and for being such a great ambassador for Freedom Readers. Thank you, Jackie. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Anytime, anytime.
I was about, I'm Carolyn Ellis from Murrells Inlet, and I was about to say something about one of the many things that I like about this design, this brilliant design that Tracy Bailey has created, is that there are relationship possibilities that are created. And that is something that does not easily happen in the school system. And I think this is one of the things that helps her program be, our program, I'm going to claim it too, be as successful, is that that possibility of relationship for somebody like Jackie Hendricks to be in relationship to, who was your mentee, Jackie? Do you remember the last person that you worked with? Putting pressure on her.
I can't, and I'm sorry, but he was so reluctant and over the participating. And then over time, he became one of the ones who would gladly get up and give his speech.
Yes.
So
yeah, I mean, and that's another accomplishment. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that to me was outstanding.
And there's no way that Jackie Hendricks, I mean, I can't imagine that she could have created that kind of opportunity on her own. And so, I mean, there's just so much richness to what Tracy has brought to this community that has to do with more than just the children that we reach out to, more than just those kindergartners through 5th graders. It is the entire community that has the potential of being blessed by the experience of reading, of talking about reading, and about relationship building. So thanks, Tracy.
Thank you, Carolyn, for all that you have invested into the Freedom Readers work, and me personally, I really appreciate it. I'm super excited that one of my high school classmates is on this call. Sandy Jackson is here from Georgetown, South Carolina, and who really got the program started in Georgetown and now serves on the board of directors for Freedom Readers. And we went to the same high school and are about 2 years apart in age. So Sandy, you want to say hey to the people?
Good evening, everyone. And I love Tracy for starting this program in Georgetown. Like I always tell Tracy, it not only helped the scholars, but it helped me too. Because even though I'm not in school anymore and I'm way past that, but I was still afraid of getting in front of people and talking. And it's hard to tell scholars to get up there and say a speech when you don't want to do it. So when they were learning, I was learning how to get up there, and say, do my part and say my speech too. So I had to encourage myself in order to encourage the other scholars, and Tracy helped me do that.
Okay. Thank you, Sandy.
You're welcome.
Sandy, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing. And I think it speaks to that kind of ripple effect of not only are these sessions and one-on-ones, but how it affects the community and confidence and the collective. I think another question came in from Becky and James about that, Tracy. There needs to be reformation in education, but also justice systems, religious organizations, art, and movies. How do your efforts intersect with all the others? And I have this visual of the spider web you reference in another way in your book, that we are all entangled in these systems. Could you speak to that?
Becky, thank you for asking that question. I really feel like our work is so important because it helps young people to build a foundation for a life of world changing. And so when you fall in love with reading and you spark that curiosity in yourself, and when you find your voice, I think that there is no way that that can ever be taken away from you by anyone. Those are two things you will take through the remainder of your life. When you understand your value, when you understand your worth, and how it is that you should be treated as a child of God and a human being on this planet, then there isn't anything that will stop you from striving to get that for yourself and for your community. And so that's what we are trying to do with young children. Wake up within them that passion for justice, that passion for speaking up, that passion for equity, and help them understand the power of compassion. Not just about knowing all things so that you can take your knowledge and conquer and dominate the entire world, but you take that knowledge and create a space for connections, for kindness, for nurturing, for understanding, and just for just receiving the goodness that is in all human beings. So I think that that's how our work really has that ripple effect, that spider web effect that Justine mentions. That's how you are prepared to be a social justice warrior on the front lines of changing the criminal justice system and movies and art and education and politics. You take it into your life and then you take that into the world, but there has to be a place where that starts. And I see it developing in these young people all the time. And that's the thing that gets me out of bed every morning. How'd I do, Becky? Do you feel it?
May I ask a question?
Excuse
Yes,
me,
ma'am.
that was great. That really touched my heart and really revealed, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I believe that, starting with the youngest, that they
Yeah.
need that kind of connection. And yeah, fantastic.
Thank you, Becky. Julia, you have a question?
I do, Tracy. Thank you. First of all, thank you for the courage to tell your story. And for me, as someone who is not a writer, the perseverance to write it so that it could be shared with others. I am so grateful that you have chosen to spend your time doing that. It means a lot. I'm kind of asking this question in a way for my daughter who could not, I sent her the link, but she couldn't be here. Tracy actually was a mentor in a national organization of educators, and my daughter met her and she told me, you should find out about this person in Myrtle Beach when we first moved to Myrtle Beach. So this is more of a macro education question, Tracy. I am so impressed and appreciative of what you have taken and done in your community, in my community now. It is vital. I just is wonderful. But thinking about the macro public education system, are there two things that you think this is what's got to be done? This is what must be changed. We have got to move in this direction. And I know that's hard because I think what you've done is miraculous for the community. But, I'm kind of thinking about our whole public education system.
Thank you for that question, Julia. Julia's daughter met me during my work with the National Urban Alliance for Effective Education. And that is where I met Jeff Brandsburg. So I'm glad that he's here and those parts of my life can kind of connect. I know that our time is short, so I'm going to try to give you the short answer to what Julia is asking. She asked for two things that I thought that the public education system needed to address or change. And I think the first thing that we have to do in terms of public education is make sure that the parents of every child understand that they are the driving force in our education system. We have to empower those people who are sending their children to school, as well as support the empowerment of educators who are actually in the classroom. I think I say this in the book, that there are many legislators and politicians and people who make decisions about what happens in education who have little knowledge of pedagogy or what actually takes place in a classroom. So the people who are actually being served, those are the ones that we have to get behind and inspire and push to the front of the line so that their voices can be heard and so they can be the ones that help shape the future of education for our children. The second thing that I think we need to make sure happens is that every educator and every person in every school building, every administrator and person in a district office understands that every child has a story. And we have to be able to see every single child and hear and appreciate their stories instead of coming along with templates and programs and all of these things that we think are going to be the next solution. You can put a child in front of a computer, but until you are able to listen to his or her story and understand his or her lived experience, then we aren't going to be able to build a bridge from who they are or where they are to where we want them to be. So it has to be about that individual connection, those relationships with those individual people, and it also has to be about empowerment of teachers and parents.
No small order, right, Tracy?
Right. It's a big deal.
And I love it. And I think we can do it. I saw a lot of nodding heads and people are energized. And I think it's a really good space to transition us to close, knowing that everyone can be involved in this process. And it is our responsibility to have everyone involved. And so, there were so many gems of wisdom, and that's one I'll be taking with me. And if you have last minute questions, please put them in the chat for the last couple minutes, but I'm going to invite Sally to close us out with one more reading from Tracy, and then we will say goodbye, and I'll let you know what to expect tomorrow.
And I'll just remind you that it's the best gift you could give to all the teachers you know and all of your friends and to the parents of your grandchildren. So I hope that you will do that. Tracy, I so love this book, and I so love that you have written it so that I can read it. I just want to ask you, in bringing us to a close, to share one more passage. And you and I had talked about a possible one that's near the end. So that one or another favorite one of yours that will allow you, through your words in the book, to end this with what it is that you really want to leave us with.
Okay, I'll read a passage near the end of the book, and I'll just invite all of you to reach out to me if you want to continue the conversation offline. I love to get emails and texts and tweets and Facebook requests. So all of those are welcome for everybody who's on this call. The potential to make a difference is real. The sparkle in the eyes of our children has not been extinguished. Hope is still springing high, and now is not the time to retreat. Now is the time to push. The story that follows describes what pushing looks like in my world these days, and the reasons that I just can't give up now. When I pulled into the parking lot of the Brick Baptist Church on a warm afternoon earlier this week, they were already there waiting for me. As I approached them, the twins turned their masked brown faces my way. Their eyes danced, told me they were smiling and welcoming me, though I was a stranger. Their team leader introduced us as I joined them under the aluminum shed. They sat in folding chairs. I sat behind a small folding table with my bags, folders, and books. We were ready to begin. The 9-year-old twins were preparing to begin 3rd grade. I called the brother over first and explained that I would ask him to read a story aloud and then retell what he could remember. I could tell that he was eager to show me what he could do. He placed his finger beneath each word and filled the air with the music of his strong voice. It rose and fell in perfect rhythm with the story's meaning. His comprehension skills matched his level of fluency. I smiled and told him he'd done a good job. As a slight breeze tickled the back of my neck, I asked him about his interests, his favorite color, video game, TV show, person. I took notes as he talked about the kind of books he liked, books about sports and geography, nonfiction. He wants to be a police officer when he is older. Finally, I showed him 5 books and asked him to choose the one that was best for him. Reptiles was the title he selected. I sent him home with it and made mental notes about the 4 books we would mail to him later. At least 1 book each week is what we expect him to read for the next 8 weeks. I would repeat that sequence 4 more times before taking the hour drive home. I met moms, grandparents, and aunties, some on their lunch break, some surprised to see me. When they said, Dr. Bailey, I really wasn't expecting you. That's what one mom told me with a flair for the dramatic. On the way home, I reflected on the significance of what I just experienced. I was sweaty, exhausted, and absolutely exhilarated all at once. Then my mind drifted to a more somber, reverent place. I realized that as much as that visit was for the benefit of the twins and their fellow scholars, it was meant to honor those whose lives were cut short before they could reach their full potential. In that moment, right there in my car, I dedicated the work to the memory of Tamir Rice, who should be getting ready for his first year of college. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor. We turn the pages of the books they can't hold. We dream the dreams they can't chase. We raise the torches they can't carry. And we protect the children here with us now. We do this work to block out the possibility for needing another hashtag, not on our watch. Thank you.